We've established that tracking was a vital skill along the early American frontier. Today on the Deerskin Diary, I'm going to share with you the final chess piece in this strategic game. And that's the hiding or the deception of those tracks to those who would follow. So stick around. This is definitely a trail that I want you to follow. But what is the art of deceiving the tracker? People often like to think that it's making it look like you were never there, becoming the proverbial ghost. But in reality, the effectiveness comes from attacking the tracker's confidence. And buckskin and linen-clad frontiersmen and natives alike used a variety of techniques to mask their movements. I was first introduced to this skill that we now call counter-tracking early on in my training. And while I have never knowingly experienced it in the field, I have worked with an individual who dealt with a criminal suspect who had put socks over his shoes in an effort to disguise his tracks. It didn't work. The fact that deceiving the tracker was a known and practiced tactic helps to define the depth of skill of trackers all along the frontier. Jean-Bernard Bossu, a French traveler in the New World in the 1750s and 60s, perhaps summed up the tracking skills of Native Americans best when he noted that, quote, "The things which betray them most often to their enemies are the smoke of their fires, which can be smelled a long way off, and their tracks. Indians can read these with almost unbelievable skill. I must admit that this knowledge seemed almost miraculous." One of the easiest but slowest methods to avoid being seen was simply to stay away from areas that were being watched. This was staying off the main roads whenever you were concerned about discovery. James Adair wrote of one native warrior that, quote, "He went through the most unfrequented and thick parts of the woods, such as a dangerous enterprise required." Europeans practiced the same skill. James Collins, just before the Battle of Kings Mountain, practiced that same skill while also adding darkness to the mix. Collins described his horse-mounted scout and escape from near capture. Quote, "After running about a mile, or perhaps a little more, we completely distanced our pursuers. There was a small path turned off to the right, which we intended taking. We suddenly tacked, and after leaving the road a short distance, we halted and stood still." The pursuers galloped right by them, the noise of their own horses and the darkness hiding Collins and his fellow compatriot from any further harm. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. Traveling in the dark oftentimes means that you will stumble into obstacles that you would obviously have avoided during daylight conditions, which can mean leaving more sign. Additionally, in this case, the darkness prevented Collins from being able to count his pursuers and fully achieve that scouting mission. Samuel Brady was said to have traveled often by night and remaining hidden by day, the sign of European tracks potentially meaning the extermination of his party. Another way that frontier folk could avoid leaving a track is to simply avoid these areas that we now know today as track traps. These are areas that are so fine of soil or have such good tracking conditions that if you walk in them, you're obviously going to leave sign that you were there. Later, in response to fleeing Sandusky, Samuel Brady was said to have taken every precaution to avoid pursuit, such as keeping on the driest ridges and walking on logs whenever they suited his course. He was still, however, followed by Indians. Now, in terms of effectiveness, this tactic is actually pretty good. The longer you can go without leaving obvious sign that you were there, the longer it will take the tracker to work out your direction of travel. And this means you can add distance to that gap. Another very common method was for everyone to simply walk in the track of the person before them. Daniel Trabue wrote that during his time in the wilderness in 1778, that, quote, "I could have a plain view of their tracks, and in one place where the Indians crossed a miry branch, I saw 3 trails. I then supposed that there was as many Indians as they was apt to step in one another's tracks." James Adair wrote that, quote, "At other times a numerous company will walk in 3 different rows by way of a decoy, everyone lifting his feet so high as to not beat down the grass or herbage, and each row will make only one man's tracks by taking the steps of him who went before, and the gigantic fellow takes the rear of each rank and thereby smooths the tracks with his feet." Now, one of the more elaborate techniques was the use of animal track mimicry, and this seems to be quite pervasive amongst both natives and Europeans. James Adair went on to say that, quote, "When the leader thinks it's the surest way of succeeding against the enemy, he sends a few of the best runners to form an ambuscade near their towns. There they sometimes fix the broad hoofs of the buffaloes and bear's paws upon their feet to delude the enemy, and they will for miles together make all the windings of these beasts with the greatest art." Now, one of my favorite quotes about tracking in the 18th century is from a story that I revealed in the first video in this series, and it's from James Smith in Loudon's Indian Narratives. And what he discusses there is being on a hunting trip with Mohawk Solomon where they come across some bison tracks, and Solomon's on guard because he doesn't know if they're actual bison tracks or catawbas. Smith goes on to recount that, quote, "He then stopped and told me an odd story about the catawbas. He said that formerly the catawbas came near one of their hunting camps and at some distance from the camp lay in ambush, and in order to decoy them out, sent 2 or 3 catawbas in the night past their camp with buffalo hooves fixed on their feet so as to make artificial tracks. In the morning, those in the camp followed after these tracks thinking they were buffalo until they were fired on by the catawbas and several of them killed." Frontier folk also used this technique. Daniel Trabue described his brother James Trabue's escape from Montreal. "They went on some distance that dark night and slept some little. When morning came, they then started, one man to steer the way, and wherever he put his foot, they all was to go in the same track. The man that was behind had a turkey's foot and a deer's foot. If the least sign was made, this hindmost man was to either to make a deer's track or a turkey's track. They knew they would be followed and they must be careful so that they could not be tracked. They kept along poor rocky ridges and putting their feet on rocks and stones, and the rest to put their feet in the same tracks." Now, I've replicated some of these tactics the only way that I know how. There are a lot of gaps in the information from then until now. The easiest and most obvious methods, as Trabue described, was simply a deer's foot. Now, this is a deer foot off of a deer that I harvested, and a dried turkey foot, and this is a turkey foot off of a turkey that I harvested. The feet are the easiest to replicate. Game animals were so abundant that acquiring a foot was as easy as shooting the animal. You probably just used it until it began to rot. Now, in terms of the effectiveness of using these animal feet to disguise my tracks, what I am able to do with them is blur the lines between my track and the undisturbed soil. I'm not necessarily trying to hide my tracks as though they are deer or turkey. I'm trying to hide the disturbance that I made and make it look like my disturbances may have actually been made by a deer or a turkey. I don't know how long you'd be able to keep this up though. It is kind of time consuming, so you'd really have to pick the tracks that you wanted to cover and then hopefully find some other way to leave fewer tracks in between. But the more elaborate ones are the bear paw moccasins and the bison hoof moccasins. I do not know how they would have attached bison hoofs to the bottom of a moccasin. That's going to bear a good bit more research if I'm ever able to figure it out. For the purposes of this video, I simply took bison hooves and attached them to the piece of river cane, and I used that to make the tracks in this video. For the bear paw tracks, I simply don't have access to bear paws large enough to make moccasins from. So what I've done is taken a smaller black bear paw that I received from a taxidermist and stitched up the paw where it was cut during the skinning process and stuffed it. Now, this would normally fit over your foot, and that's how you would leave the tracks. This would quite honestly only fit over probably a child's foot. This was not always the case in the 18th century though. These bear paw moccasins are attributed to the Choctaw culture and currently reside in a collection in France. They bear a strong resemblance to modern carpet shoes, a type of overshoe seen in use with smugglers along the Mexican border. Both are designed to disguise a human footprint and fool pursuers, but for entirely different reasons. But more importantly to me, these bear paw moccasins reveal so much more about how wild and wonderful the frontier must have been. Everything from the size of the bear to the color of the fur raises so many more questions in my mind. This book reveals that the art is not entirely lost, and nor is the history. During my research, I came across the topic in a book published in 1948 titled Tracks and Trailcraft. And this book I received as a gift mentions native tracking and counter-tracking techniques, and while I can't vouch for the accuracy of some of the material that's presented, it is encouraging to see that the information hasn't been totally lost over the generations.